Hi, I'm welcoming Riel Miller. I'm very happy to have you here on board to have this interview with you. And usually I don't introduce my interview partners with reciting all their credentials. Usually I prefer to introduce them with a little story I share. And with you, I share a lot of emails. We wrote each other over the course of recent years, and more specifically, what I really loved about the experience with exchanging thoughts and ideas with you, that you were incredibly reliable in terms of responding and diving into difficult, challenging topics. And I know it doesn't sound like much of a compliment, but I think in times where we are living in a world where, it sometimes feels it's out of control and chaotic and is often enough dishonest. I think this is it made all the difference in the world to have this exchange with you. So without further ado, I would really love to dive into your topics of futures literacy and your experience over a few decades, as far as I know,
Yeah.
at OECD and UNESCO on that level, working with futures, for futures, about futures with different groups all around the world. And maybe you can already introduce your topic a little bit and tell us how often have you been asked to elaborate what futures literacy is and how your response over recent years has changed.
Yes, thank you, Daniel, and then thank you for the exchange. I think um, it's been very good for me to be able to exchange with you because it provided, as always, a window into concerns, into perspectives, into the difficulties, but also, I would say, the creativity, the aspirations, the hopes that are part of what it means to be a learning person in this world. So, since that's what I aspire to be, a learning person in the world, I too appreciate the chance that you and I have had to exchange and to share. So, and I appreciate this opportunity as well. Um, Futures literacy as a competency has a complicated history for me personally, because it's the outcome of my own wandering, as these things always are. And when you wander, you can look up, you can look down, you can look sideways, you can smell, you can taste, you can do all sorts of things as you wander. Um, but in my wandering, I think I've been quite biased. I mean, I think everybody's biased, but my bias has been towards uh, trying to understand better uh, the discomfort that I felt with agency. That's kind of maybe the broadest way of putting it. Is that I think it's hard to be, as I am, a child of the 20th century without being very suspicious of the way humans try to do things. Because almost no matter where you look, I mean, like you said, dishonest, but I mean, to me, that's not an inherent characteristic. I don't believe, I personally, I don't believe in things like original sin. It's not an inherent characteristic. It's the way that we cope in our environment. And that leads us to the question of reproduction. Why do we reproduce crazy systems? Systems that are destructive, systems that are wasteful of everything. I mean, wasteful of meaning, wasteful of time, wasteful of resources, etc. I mean, what's the point of being alive if you end up spending most of your time just wasting um, that incredible reality of being alive. So with this idea of somehow living fully, the desire to live fully, but very suspicious of the role, the position that humans find themselves in this play. Um, I paid attention to particular things, right? I was looking for kind of, some of the sources of what you could characterize as a pathology, but also um, the way to build transitions. And those transitions can take many different forms away from where we find ourselves now to something else.
Hmm.
And since I was very suspicious of that something else, meaning I didn't want to provide solutions. I think part of the problem was, oh, I've got the solution, I have the vision. Yeah, bullshit. Um, I didn't want to find myself in that same contradictory, inherently, self-destructive situation. So that led to a lot of wandering. And the result of all that, a lot of that wandering is, I think, not surprisingly, to a certain extent, capability based. So if I were to create a dualism, one would be goal oriented thinking, and the other one would be capability based thinking. And there's a whole history now in the 20th century, Amartya Sen and others, about capability and competency and the capacity based thinking, and the relationship of the capacity to be free, as a provocation, really. Um, and so for a long time now, I've been thinking about this issue, the capacity to be free. So once you look at capacity or capability or context to be free, um, uh, you start to pay attention to certain things. And that also led me to think about anticipation, imagination, fear, hope, the sources of our imagination, the power of our imagination, the distinction between perception and choice, et cetera, et cetera. So that's kind of a big picture version.
Oh, I noticed that. I mean, you are a great public speaker. I know that, and I noticed that you don't necessarily use much of jargon, heavy terminologies. Does it help to explain like the field of futures, if it's a field or the idea of futures, um, with a clearer, more simplified language, so that
Well,
it becomes tangible for everyone?
Well, it's kind of you. It's kind of you to say that, but I mean, I often get, I often get accused of using quite technical language and also making things confusing and difficult to understand. And I'll speak to that in a second. But let me say this first. One of the things that I discovered very early in my career, because I was invited in 1988 to manage a process with thousands of people to think about the future of community colleges in Ontario. I'm from Canada. And what was really very clear to me right from the beginning there was that first, the future is very, very powerful. People want to think about the future. People must think about the future. People know that they have to think about the future. And even if they're not explicit about it, they understand the power of the future for hope, for fear, but also, I think, implicitly. And this is one of the problems, that it's tacit and not explicit. It's not metacognitive. It's just subconscious cognitive perception. I think they realize that their attention is structured by the way they imagine the future. So the result is that there's this, you're dealing with this dynamite. You're dealing with this something that can explode, something that can damage, something that people are afraid of, something that people don't have a lot of experience with. And so that was also one of the challenges of my wandering, which is, how do you get people to begin to think about something in the open, when very often they want to keep it closed because they don't feel capable. And if they don't feel capable, they just prefer not to deal with it. They prefer to let the horoscope, they prefer to let the prophet, the visionary, they prefer to let the leader think about the future, the father, the papa, think about the future, than to think about the future themselves because they don't feel competent. They don't feel capable. And it's too important to not think about the future, but that means they'll take somebody else's future. And we see this everywhere. Um, People will do that. So uh, I've tried to find ways to talk about the future that start where people are at, start with their own ideas about the future. And that means, generally speaking, introducing them to probable futures first and then desirable futures. Um, and it's quite natural for people to do that. But once you do this explicitly, in other words, invite people to talk about the future, you pretty quickly get them to acknowledge the limits of their understanding, the limits of their reference points, the poverty, what I call the poverty of their imagination. And when people realize that their imagination is thin, misunderstood, they haven't distinguished different, then you can engage in a conversation which I think helps them to begin to build up their competency, which is the idea of futures literacy. So you begin to become more futures literate as you begin to work with the future. So that's the approach that I've really used. I actually don't like public speaking from the point of view of learning, because I think that the future is too powerful for people to be told about it. They need to experience it. They need to connect with their own anticipatory systems and processes. Of course, they don't call it that, but they need to connect with their own imagination, the sources, the structures, the narrative structures, etc., the myths. And by doing so, they become obviously more capable. And so it's the empowerment side. Um, Again, the literacy concept, when you learn to read and write, you become capable of doing something you could not do before. Learning to read and write opens up a world to you. You can read other people's ideas, you can transmit your own ideas. So the idea of futures literacy, like reading and writing literacy, is really meant to kind of evoke an empowerment relationship. And because for me that's the crux, that's the really core issue, I actually am not unhappy or discomforted by confusion. Because at the beginning, when somebody learns to read and write, they're going to be confused. They're going to say, "Oh, or where's the A go? Where's the B go? How do I do? What's the letters? Why do the letters go in this order?" Except that it's going to be, you need to learn about it. You don't know. So when when initiating a process for thinking about the future, the fact that people feel confused or feel uncertain, to me is a good sign, because to me that's the beginning of a learning process. So you know that requires really um, always thinking about context. How do you create a learning context? How do you initiate a learning voyage? How do you provoke people or invite people or cultivate the desire to acknowledge that we do not know? Because not knowing, ignorance, is the beginning of a learning voyage. If you already know it, you're not going to learn it. So you have to realize you don't know.
And if you
And then
pretend you know that, you will definitely not ask the question.
yeah, that's it. So you need to create the context where that happens. Exactly.
Yeah. But I think when we walk through or when we speak with an individual, with each other, um, with someone alone, it becomes very clear that this is easy to understand, and everyone will individually join that learning experience, I think, as far as I'm concerned. But then there are organizations. And that's a completely different animal, so to say, because uh, weirdly, even organizations consist of people, they work differently. Why is there this mm, boundary of bringing organizations into this kind of learning experience? As far as I'm concerned, I think it's more challenging to work with an entire organization or a department rather than with an individual.
Yeah. I mean, you and I have discussed this in different ways from, in different contexts. So I mean, essentially, we live in a toxic environment. The current environment, the current human kind of ecology, the ecology of, I mean, and you discuss this with other people as well. I mean, we live in this toxic context, um, which which uh, which has been developing for centuries, and which is very effective at reproducing itself because it's goal oriented, and it casts human agency in a godlike position. And this is very seductive for individuals and very seductive for institutions. And it has the virtue from an evolutionary kind of continuity perspective of being easy to reproduce. In other words, to pass from one generation to the next. Because if you say to a young person, look, the most important thing is to know the future, to be certain. And of course, that makes complete sense to a young person because when they cross the street, they want to be sure that they'll get to the other side. When they eat something, they want to be sure that it'll be good for them, et cetera, et cetera. Survival requires that we refine, test, explore our anticipatory systems and processes related to certainty, the ones that are continuity and repetitive. All right. But the world around us is actually not like that. The world around us is emergent and continuously changing and is about difference, not repetition. So we live in this very biased environment where we're continuously trying to control and determine, and where it's very easy to reproduce because you say to people, if you don't know the future, you should be frightened. So what do we want to do? We want to find ways to know the future. So to control tomorrow, forecasting, pyramids, castles, fortresses, dominance, etc. And so the power of the future ends up serving the reproduction of hierarchy and oppression. And so the institutions are just an expression of that hierarchy and that oppressiveness, that is all at the service of certainty and reproducing what we already know, which means the past, and not being open to not knowing and to emergence and to discontinuity, right? Um, so it's the institutions and the individuals function in this environment, and we become very good at reproducing it. Um, but of course, our planet is telling us something. Our planet is holding up a non-ideological mirror and saying, humans, you know, I don't give a damn what happens to you, but I want you to notice that you are destroying your own home. And that maybe you should draw some lessons from destroying your own home if you're unable to draw lessons from killing each other, because that we've been doing in profusion for all of history, okay? Killing each other. So if you can't learn from the stupidity and horror of killing each other, maybe you can learn from seeing that the planet says there's a problem. I don't know. I mean, this of course is very speculative, but I think we live at a time when we're well positioned to question the fundamental relationship of humans to time and humans to the universe, and to try to um, fundamentally alter the transmission between one generation and the next of knowledge. So the knowledge that we've been transferring in most contexts has been knowledge that is toxic. It's toxic not only in its conception, meaning its purpose, but also in its epistemology, the way we transmitted it. So the rote learning, the hierarchical learning, the anti-experience learning, the complete disappearance of wisdom, and the uniqueness of wisdom because it's related to each person's experience. All of that, the fact that it kind of disappears in the current world, are to me symptoms of a toxic knowledge ecology, and a toxic way of reproducing the organization of human communities.
Do you think that future studies, strategic foresight, futures literacy can do that? Can offer this learning experience holistically
Well,
and fully?
but
Or
but
does
let
it?
me make it.
Yeah.
Yeah, go on. I mean, I think there's a distinction that needs to be made.
Okay.
Um, so the thing is that in a functional sense, planning is fundamental to goals, obviously. If I want to get to the top of Mount Everest, I need to make a plan. If I want to have a budget for next year for government or for a company, I need to make a plan. And the plan is about the future and the future goals and how to get there. I mean, that's just the way it is, right? Um, so that's where futures thinking is absolutely fundamental. It's inherent, and then we confront the difficulty from the managerial perspective and the budget and planning perspective. We confront the recognition, let's call it from a. I'm hesitant to use the word scientific, but let's say from the point of view of our efforts to understand the universe, that there's a difference between risk and uncertainty. For instance, um, and 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 so we have this problem, which is we manage risk, but we have no idea what to do with uncertainty. And
Mhm.
since we want to manage risk, and it works more or less for risk, um, more or less, huh? Suddenly we want to use management for uncertainty. But as the theoreticians of uncertainty have explained, you can't do that. You cannot manage uncertainty. So you're epistemologically at a dead end. You're just, there's no. Now, the point that I'm making here is this, is that I think there's a difference between efforts to do future studies at the service of goals, what I call anticipation for the future, and what I would call the discipline of anticipation or the theory of anticipatory systems and processes. And I think that the theory of anticipatory systems and processes is much broader, much wider than the the planning dominated futures work that is all pervasive. And why is it all pervasive? Because planning is all pervasive. So it's not a blame. It's just there's a lot of need for futures thinking for planning. But planning is like what I call one leg, and the universe consists of two legs: bets and emergence. And I would say that the universe is actually completely emergent. Difference is the dominant characteristic of this universe. Time and space are changing all the time. So we have this challenge as humans to begin to understand that relationship. And that's where I think the capability of futures literacy as an entry point or an access to a broader theoretical foundation for humans' relationships to time. So pluralizing our relationships to time, and understanding that we have multiple temporalities and multiple ways of anticipating, takes us well beyond future studies as foresight future studies as forecasting. So to me, the point here is to essentially reposition or establish a different framework for future studies. Now, just one little word on this. We have obviously a lot of inertia. There's a lot of, legacy systems, and there's a lot of path dependency. And when we say future studies, we're already using a term that's in one way or another connected to the university system, university institutions. Universities are part of a knowledge ecosystem that has its own specific predators and alphas and all the rest, power relationships, and so of course knowledge is about power, and so you find the situation where people who are teaching planning in one way or another and serving the planning needs of the dominant and very powerful, very, very all preoccupying needs of planning. Think about future studies in the siloed way that the university has evolved. And you get a situation where there's a relatively, I would say, confusing and contradictory position for future studies. And one of the things that I try to work on is to provide the kinds of theoretical foundations that would not only clarify the different dimensions, different aspects, different ontologies of futures studies that future studies looks at, but also begin to break out of the narrow epistemic kind of traps that the university system has gone into. And what I mean here is that I try to say that because the future is only imaginary, can only be imagined, it is inherently pluriepistemic. So the topic of future studies as the discipline of anticipation is inherently pluriepistemic. Therefore, it cannot be confined into the traditional epistemic silos of the university. And I think one of the things that's happening in the current evolutionary process ecosystems that we live in is that we have no choice, and gradually we're becoming willing and able to recognize, although it's very disruptive and disturbing and frightening, is for people to recognize that you cannot be monoculture from an epistemic perspective. That you just won't comprehend the world, and the world does not function that way. So the people who want to put the genie, the back in the bottle, they don't want to be disturbed by the differences that characterize from points of view of perspectives and epistemologies. They're trying desperately to put it back in the bottle, but they can succeed for a little while, and they can put people in prison and they can execute people, but the universe will not change because of that. They can't change the universe. This they cannot do, and so it'll come back one way or the other. So I mean, my sense here is that we currently live in a conjuncture where a lot of this is on the table, and it's a very rich environment for challenging and questioning and trying to move forward. So that was a long way of answering your question about futures literacy and foresight. But really, I feel that what I'm trying to argue here is that future studies, as I understand it, is not the same as future studies as we understood it in the 20th century.
I mean, generally speaking, we all use the word future or futures so easily, and then still polysemy, I hope I pronounced the word right, it still has a different meaning for every one of us. So what we are thinking about it differs a lot. We might use the same word, but we think very differently about it. So maybe to have the parallel here, uh, I think that maybe what you're, if I understand correctly, it's not necessarily for you so much about anticipating the next event or the events that might unfold eventually, but a fundamental change in how we approach uncertainty and complexity, and embody this new sense of anticipation without like having the necessary need to always be, predictive, but to be comfortable with the uncomfortable.
It's a very look, I mean, and I'm not going to pretend that I can provide that much insight into a question that has been troubling or, intriguing humanity for centuries and centuries. But let me put it my version of that in the following sense. I think that there's actually a simultaneity. In other words, it's always both. And this is not, but the difficulty is that it's like those experiments with the face in the glass. There's a glass and it's two faces looking at each other, or it's a glass and
Mm.
you can see the glass or you can see the faces. You can see the glass or you can see the faces. I mean, whether that's a cognitive limitation of the human brain or not, I don't know. So is it a neurological problem? This question of simultaneity, but it seems to me that the we can become much more adept, so much less cost, much easier with training, experience, metacognitive, so learning about these issues, of flipping back and forth, continuously flipping back and forth between emergence and betting. So we make bets, right? We make bets all the time, and they're irrevocable. And we do that on the basis of I'm going to bet that I'm going to cross the street. I'm going to bet that I'm going to have this interview with you. We're going to do it. There's no way of revoking it. Once you've done it, you've done it. But at the same time, we have no idea what's going to happen from the point of view of emergence and our conscious awareness, the ideas that will be sparked, how they'll be sparked, the way in which we'll be influenced and connected to our environment, to the fact that it's a gray day out here, or that we're doing this on Zoom, etc. All of those factors are hugely emergent. And being sensitive and open to that constant emergence, I think, is something that we can become better at through practice, and that practice transitions from childhood searches for anticipatory systems that function on the basis of certainty to subsequent, less protected, because children are protected, less protected environments where ambiguity, emergence are actually wonderful. They're the sources of inspiration, they're the sources of learning, they're the sources of amusement. And so instead of seeing difference and emergence as threatening, we see it as fuel, fuel for our imaginations, fuel for understanding each other, fuel for change, etc. And so, you know, I, what disturbs me is that I've used this metaphor before, and it's good and it's bad, as like metaphors usually are. But I talk about walking on two legs,
Mm.
and we take for granted that we walk on two legs, right? But of course, if you watch a baby, they had to learn how to negotiate the two legs, or our two eyes. We see the world in stereo. If you have two eyes, you see the three. But of course, the brain is working on putting this all together. But of course, we take it for granted. So if we live in a universe where we walk on two legs of emergence and bets, making irrevocable choices. How do we do this more effectively? And I think we're actually very underprepared. So I don't know, because there is no way to know what it would be like to live in a world where everybody can read and write. Once everybody learns to read and write, I get fake news.
Mm.
I mean, who would have thought? Should I have told Gutenberg to not invent the printing press so that we could avoid fake news? Or tell Henry Ford to not invent the assembly line for the automobile because it would lead to climate change? No, you can't do those things. So we live in this emergent, strange world where things happen. What would a world be like if people had a different relationship to time, a different relationship to human agency, if we were not trying to play God, if we were not trying continuously to burden future generations with our legacy based on the glory of our immortality and our brilliance. Well, I mean, it would be a very, very different world. And I think that their capacity to be simultaneously in emergence and anticipation for the future for the future would be different. But I don't know what that's like because we're not there.
And some mention or some point out that the examples you just used are all like linear technologies. And some point out that now we live in this time of exponential technology. So our ability for foresight, to foresee what are the consequences of the consequences, need to evolve much faster. Um, because let's take the example of deep sea drilling, which is apparently, as far as I remember, up for debate this year, um, if it's being implemented or not. But the rights to mine are already more or less
Yeah,
distributed. So, but the devastating consequences of such a technology, of such an intervention, is exponentially higher than, let's say, the car fumes we have in front of our doors.
yeah. I mean, I'm pretty technology agnostic, and I'm also very skeptical about speed change. Um, for one thing, we are our tools. This is my point of view on this. Our tools don't do things independently of us. So if we do something stupid like drilling, um, or if we do something stupid like atomic bombs, um, if you ban bombs, then you do the drilling. If you don't do the drilling, you do something else. In other words, we're basically toxic. So the if you're toxic, then your tools are toxic. It's the humans that are. This is us. So I don't distinguish us from our tools. On the question of speed and exponentiality, I, I, I think that there are moments, obviously cyclical or circular, of combinatorial, um, up and down. So, you can reduce the number of permutations in a system by eliminating agents. You have fewer if you have two places to go to back and forth, well, your combinations are very limited. If you have 1,000 places to go, well, your combinations are huge. Okay, so yeah, fine. But the discontinuity, for me, complex emergent systems do have tipping points, do have discontinuities. And I think, take COVID pandemic as a good example. It doesn't require 5 years, 10 years, 100 years. It doesn't require, some sort of exponential or whatever. A tipping point is bang, and bangs happen. And surprise is the nature of this universe. So I'm very hesitant to use the vocabulary and conceptual framing of linearity, to understand the world around us. I think it's a simplification which can be useful if you're taking the train from Paris to London. But otherwise, it's pretty deceptive, actually. And that way of mapping the world around us and mapping our position in the world is not very helpful.
Hmm. So how is it then possible to identify the pathologies, the toxicity in our thinking, to to have this epistemological therapy, to learn to deal with uncertainty and ambiguity, and feel comfortable being tolerant towards ambiguity. Um, I mean, all this is like a
Yeah,
huge
it's a big
assignment,
ask. It's
a
a
huge
big ask.
task. And in addition to that, as far as I know, that it's not that easy to change other people's way of thinking, and I don't even know if it's even supposed to be like that, that we
Yeah,
should approach it in that direction.
I'm
Um,
I'm I'm with you. I mean, I'm not looking to change consciousness, um, and I'm not looking to change the world or to make a difference. That's not those aren't the kinds of frames that I feel
and
comfortable with.
if I may interrupt, sorry,
Yeah,
but even starting studies or starting the future studies program and going through the whole learning experience, I had to learn basically that even though I really like the material, I like the cognitive tools, I like the science fiction background in some sense, I like the narratives, I like the idea of working with people, still, I had to learn that my idealism is really in the way. You know what I mean? Because my idealism
yeah,
will always like distract me from the difficulties that exist in the here now and with which I have to deal with, and have to approach it in a very nuanced, sensitive manner without impinging my ideas and my idealism upon the situation or other people. So, and this is also a huge thing to learn, or like a huge difficulty to carry and to even like um, let's say formalize or
yeah.
methodologically establish.
You raise a very, important and difficult question about, um, you know, how to, in a sense, um, reposition. So, and position implies a different standing on a different terrain. So, changing the foundations. And I started with this point about idealism. I was very, very um, troubled by goal oriented thinking, ideology, communism, fascism, whatever ism. Um, and the role that put humans in from the point of view of power um, and and pretension. So, it's. I mean, I'm afraid, given the way we're uh, made. I mean, given the frameworks transferred to us about what is valuable, what is important, what is uh, honored, what is admired, what is compensated by finance or whatever, and the relationship that has to planning. I want to pick the right career, and I want that career to make me rich and happy. I want to pick the right spouse, and I want to have the romantic life in a Disney movie, et cetera, et cetera. In other words, the things that we hope for, our aspirations, our expectations, they are shaped in such a way that if somebody gives me a crystal ball, think of think of Tolkien. If somebody gives me a crystal ball, oh yeah, cool, fantastic, wow. I mean, what's better than a crystal ball? In other words, because our relationship to the future is around the heroic, it's around the planning, it's around the search and the credibility of your certainty. I'm credible because I'm a scientist. I can predict the future, which I think is a false definition of science. But being able to break out of that, I don't think is something that can be told to people. I think that what we can do is we can provide affordances related to metacognitive um, cultivation of something that we experience. In other words, I think everybody develops their own wisdom, despite the fact that nobody ever talks about wisdom. Okay, because you have no choice. You learn through experience, you integrate that into your thinking, into your way of being, and you deal with it. You just don't pay a lot of attention to it. You don't say, hey, I didn't know what the hell I was doing, but I kind of, learned from the process. You don't say I was ignorant. You don't say, I don't know if I'm going to make a difference. And in fact, what I did might turn out to be bad because I don't know. No, you can't say that. You have to say, no, 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 what I did is going to be good, must be good. I must know in advance that it will be good, and that the world will be better because I did this. But that kind of pretension and the need to sustain the illusion of that pretension, it becomes a self-reinforcing toxic cycle. And so, how we're going to break out of it, how we're going to mature, as it were, and make it easier and more, I think, effective. Well, all I can say is that you plant seeds, you plant experiments, you create situations, you try and walk the talk, even if you don't know what walking the talk means. You experiment and attempt to do it in ways that make sense from a transitional perspective. And that's where there is some, point of reference. Say, I don't want to be like this. I want to transition away from. And then you experiment with transitioning away from. But keep in mind, and I mean, this is a very, I mean, I think it's important to be very humble and understand the limitation. You're transitioning away from, meaning you're defining yourself on the basis of what you don't like. You're defining yourself on the basis of what already exists.
Hmm.
So you're not actually in the emergent. You're very captured, very tied. And so we can't escape. But what we can do is we can attempt and experiment and try and find joy. So plant seeds, cultivate, fertilize, fall down, experiment, um, try and exemplify. I don't mean exemplify in the sense of everybody following, but exemplify from the point of view of kind of karma, if you will. I mean, kind of being the change you want to be. And that's a slogan. You don't know how far it's going to go, um, but as things collapse and fall apart, as the fire passes, there are seeds that are there afterwards. There are elements of things that build and that grow. Evolutionary systems, we don't, you can't predict what's going to succeed, what's going to fail, how it's going to fail. And it's not going to be the first order, the best solution, the optimal solution. It'll be second best, third best, fourth best, because it was a good day, a bad day for the fourth best version. Whereas for the first best version, it was a bad day in the storm, got hit by lightning. Who knows, right? It's wide open. So that's not very satisfying from a vanguardist perspective. I want to be in the leadership of creating a better world, and make a difference. But I think it's much more satisfying from the point of view of learning, and sharing, and not reproducing the toxicity of how can we create systems that reflect the pretension of godlike power.
Hmm. Inherently, I think we are actually novelty seekers. So it's not even like logical that we persist on a status quo or on path dependencies or business as usual. Because let's take our tongue, right? I
Yeah,
mean, we have to eat different foods, different meals, because I don't think I personally can't eat 5 times in a row the same food. So our taste buds are designed in such a way that it craves different nutritions.
yeah, yeah,
And so therefore we are in the process of novelty seeking, at least when it regarding taste.
yeah.
Um, so
I,
so why not using this understanding for our organizations?
yeah. Look, I mean, I have to say that I agree with you that difference, so things that are not repetitive, are fundamental to everything happening all around us. I mean, we're in a time space is moving, so every moment is inherently different. But humans happen to have a high tolerance for boredom and for adapting to cope with oppression. So we live under very boring and oppressive conditions that are full of repetition, and we have bought the illusion that repetition, because it is certain, it is familiar. I can promise you that this will be the same as this. Stasis, no change, make the world great again.
I think
Um,
we can add loneliness to the list as well. That
yeah,
also is it's breeding obedient individuals, leading to very dystopian societies.
yeah. I mean, look, you cope as best you can, and as you get injured. So if you're lonely and you're bored, both of which I think are painful, involve suffering, you learn to inure yourself to it. You bite the bullet and you tolerate it, and you find small compensations. And this is one of the interesting things. And again, it goes back to your the kinds of discussions around scale and change and speed. Is that each person, I think, has their own big change, even if it's small compared to somebody else. Everybody has their small changes compared to somebody else, etc. And so we because of our individual consciousness in a collective and entangled universe, um, we have those gyroscopic or kind of stabilizing capacities as well. Otherwise, we'd fall apart. So, we do cope with things that should not be, that are not good for us in a sense. Um, and then we die. So um, it's not about the optimality of a particular individual either.
Yeah.
It's an evolutionary process of the collective. I think there's a big difference between the cells and the body, but I don't think that the body is the macro version of the cells. So we live in an assemblage universe, etc. Um, all of those things are quite difficult for us to uh, um, make part of our lives in a meaningful way, given the toxic environment we live in.
Yeah, yeah, no, I agree. What about temporal innovation? Maybe as a nice concluding topic. Um, do you sense that there is something emergent in regarding temporal innovation that we are going to see a time? I mean, I'm not asking you to predict something, but
No, no.
like your observation in the field and among your colleagues and peers.
Look, there's a very strong tension at the moment between uh, difference and repetition. So meaning that we had a period in which there was openness to everybody wearing the same clothes. There was openness, the different clothes, and so not wearing a uniform, to recognizing that each person has their own way of seeing and doing things. Um, uh, and so there was an openness to that, and to a certain extent, an encouragement of that, which includes obviously free speech, et cetera, et cetera. And now we have a backlash. We have a
Hmm.
backlash that's related to many factors. But I think one of the fundamental problems, and here I am offering a solution in a sense, is that just like the transition from rural peasant society to urban industrial society was greatly facilitated by the emergence, I don't say the planning or design, the emergence of the industrial school system. I think that the development of the capabilities, both behavioral and cognitive, that are related to a world of difference rather than a world of repetition is fundamental to the transition. And so, again, and I think rather obviously, I would put futures literacy as one way to become more aware of multiple temporalities is a transition cultivating, a transition enabling approach to the situation that we find ourselves in today. And I can just say, by way of conclusion, that my messages around this, around the discipline of anticipation, around changing future studies, around pluriepistemic ways of thinking, all of that resonates quite nicely in many different parts of the world, in different ways and with different histories. But I don't think we're quite ready, and I don't think that we'll be successful in reestablishing uniformity, so repetition and kind of standardization, massification, as the kind of operative principle. I think difference is omnipresent, and we can resist it for a certain amount of time through oppression and through imposing uniformity by taking commandments and legal approach to building structures, but that gradually humans will evolve towards, and I think capability is crucial in terms of how this transition will occur, to living in the universe we live in. We can't live outside our universe forever.
Although we are masters of niche construction, we might be building fantastic places to hang out with at outer
They
space.
can go to Mars and reproduce it, and it'll be the same crap.
Yeah, probably.
Yeah,
I thank you very much for this interview, for your time and for your wisdom you shared. And
thank you.
always a pleasure to talk to you. Um,
Yes, you too.
so
Thanks, Daniel.
thank you for that. Lovely.
Okay, thanks a lot.
Now I have to find the right button.